Good morning, everyone. Hello. Great to see so many of you here. I'm Arthur Turrell. I'm a Deputy Director at the Data Science Campus of the Office for National Statistics, and I'm delighted to be here today to chair what promises to be a really exciting, interesting session. And I was particularly pleased to be asked to chair this session because ultimately, what question goes closer to the heart of what we are trying to do at a National Statistical Office? How to value data, how to understand valuing data. These are key questions. And I'm hoping by the end of the session, my job's going to be a lot easier, actually. They're going to sort it all out for me. But this is a really difficult problem, you know, and it's one I think about all the time. What data set do we invest in next? What's going to give the greatest return? What's going to deliver the greatest public good? How do we trade off between timeliness, accuracy, and granularity? And I know that some of those questions are going to be addressed today, and rarely do we have market prices to guide us in this. So this is an important and difficult problem. And we're going to hear some excellent takes on these in these three talks with 6 excellent speakers. And I'm sure by the end of the session, we're all going to be a bit better placed to navigate some of these tricky questions. So we're going to be hearing from Diane, who's going to tell us about the social value of data. We're going to be hearing from Hugo, who's going to tell us about the Stats Netherlands thinking on these fundamental questions of data value. And we're going to start with a remote talk from Robbins, who's going to talk about something which I think is massively underappreciated as a change that's going on in society today, which is the enormous value of open source code, which of course is a kind of data. I've seen how transformative that can be in organizations for productivity and automation. And that was using public sector IT. So imagine what it's going to do to the rest of the world. So really exciting stuff. Now, just to remind all of the speakers how we're going to run the session today for the 3 speakers and 3 discussants is we're going to have 15 minutes of talk, then we're going to have 5 minutes for the discussant to discuss the paper, and then we're going to have 10 minutes Q&A, and that will both be from people at home and also from people in the audience too. So without further ado, I will hand over to Carol to give the first talk, a first look at open software investment in the United States and other countries, 2009 to 2019. Thank you.
Okay. Hello, everyone. Let's see. I don't quite see my, okay, perfect. I think you all do see my slides. Thank you, Arthur. So I'm very happy to be able to share this work with you this morning. This has been a real team effort of economists and data scientists. And as exploratory work, the usual disclaimer applies to our respective institutions. Okay, let's see if this works. Next, I hit next. There, oh, are we good? Yes, fantastic. So the definition that we use for open source software is from the Open Source Initiative. And we say open source software is computer software, but the code is made available so that users can study, change, and distribute it to anyone for any purpose. And here I think is what is really key is that this open source software, yes, it is created in the business sector, but it's also developed, maintained, and extended by universities, governments, nonprofits, and individuals. Okay, and this I think is really critical when we think about what is the source of these intangible assets. So just to tell you what where we're going, using the method that I'm going to describe to you, we estimate a rapidly rising capital stock of open source software with a value that we consider a lower bound of $110 billion in 2019 and $37 billion in investment in the United States. And we do this, we believe, within the existing framework of the system of national accounts, okay? So, here's my next. Okay, So you've heard a lot. I think everyone has a real firm foundation in the Corrado, Holton, and Sickle framework for measuring intangibles. And this really is the groundwork for what we do. So we sort of think about what are the intangibles that are these tools that are used in production, and can we put together a method that's consistent with measuring other intangibles? And we got really excited, I think, about open source software when we read a paper by Shane Greenstein and Frank Nagel, where what they were able to do was actually go out on the internet and measure every Apache server and every Microsoft server that was out there. And then because they actually had the queues, the quantity, right, they could use the price from the Microsoft server to apply that to the Apache server to get a value of this open source tools, which have zero cost. And then that work was extended to other kinds of server software. And then I think the other thing that's been really important to us is to think about why it is that people create open source software. And the work of Eric von Hippel has been critical to us, that not only are people doing it for their own use, but they're also doing it to enhance their skill set. And then you'll see as we walk through this paper that the framework is really a very kind of straightforward national accounting one that Dan Sickle and Eric von Hippel put together with respect to measuring household innovation based on the time spent using it. So we're going to try to figure out the time spent creating open source software, which is a tool freely available for others to use. So that's what we do. Okay. In order to develop this method, which I would call a bottom-up method, we started a couple of years ago with two programming languages that are available in open source, R and Python. And R, of course, when I first became acquainted with it, it looked like a substitute for SAS, right? But it's free. We don't have to pay $1,000 or whatever. And so what we did was we said, can we work from the bottom up to develop an estimate of the value of creating the R packages, which would be on CRAN. CRAN is the repository for R packages, and the Python packages on PyPy. And so what we did was we used this definition that I described, the open source initiative approved license. There's probably about 20, which packages are production ready. And then what we did was we scraped the metadata and we had information about the lines of code, the additions, and information about the contributors. And based on that, we estimated, and this is a couple of years ago, that the resource cost through 2017 was about $1.6 billion for the R packages and about $900 billion for the Python packages. And that gave us basically a method that we then thought, how can we scale this up? And that's kind of what we've been about. Okay. Next slide. Next. Whoops. I hope I didn't, sorry guys, sorry about that. Okay, so the scale up was actually one of the most interesting parts of the process. How do we find something that's somewhat near representative? For the United States, we feel confident that GitHub is a good base to start. And so GitHub is the most broadly used repository for open source software. And there's information there which tells us whether or not it has an open source approved license. And there's a lot of stuff on GitHub that's not that, but you can identify what has an open source approved license. And we collected information on this development activity. And so in the spirit of what we're really talking about, our team of data scientists and economists created a tool. This is by Juan Santiago Calderon, ghost.jl, it was a Julia package, to collect information on this development activity. So a tool to scrape. And so we gathered information from almost 8 million repositories and over 3 million distinct contributors. And what you can see in our little chart there is the very rapid growth in the number of repositories, and that's going to be reflected in the number of users and also the amount of activity there. And so with that information that we scraped, we also created, and in this case, this is my colleague Brandon Kramer, created 2 software tools, TidyOrgs and DiverseTidy, to classify the data into sectors and countries. So what we tried to do was really, use tools to do our work. Okay, can I get the next slide? Thank you. Okay, so based on the number of contributors, what we found, now GitHub is broadly used in the United States, over 300,000 contributors from the United States on GitHub. The next most country with the highest number of contributors is China. And then after that, India and Germany. Okay, can I get the next slide? Thank you. So we have this number of contributors, and then how do we figure out the level of effort? What we did in this particular case is we used a software engineering model called Kokomo. It sounds like a nice place to visit, but it's a software model. And Barry Boehm and his colleagues put this model together so that you could figure out, if you were creating a software project, how much time it would take. And so there are 2 different parameters. One is the amount of effort, right? And then the other is the skills of the team. And there are 3 different parameters that he uses. One is pretty much aligned to applications, another to utility software, and another to system software. We use the most broadly defined category, which we call organic software. And the parameters here, the reason that you have these exponents is that the more complicated the project is, the costs increase non-linearly. And so with that, can I please have the next slide? Thank you. So what we find, scraping this data from GitHub, we see that, as you would suspect, the United States has the largest level of contributions in terms of person months. So what we're calculating based on lines of code is person months to create that, over 2 million. And then the next highest contributor as a country is China. And but what I want to show you here is that the contributions by country is different from the number of contributors. And so when you look by lines of code, you're going to find that Germany and the United Kingdom are putting out a lot of code. And you're going to see that kink there. That kink there in 2008 is a reflection, I think, of our scraping procedure. And so my belief is that when we bring in our 2020 numbers, that line will look a little bit more normal. Okay, so next one, please. Can I have the next slide? Okay, so what does this imply when we do this? So we have person months, and then what we have to do is we have to convert this into a dollar value. And the way that we do this is the method that you've heard, I think, described in creating other kinds of own account output. We build up from the sum of costs. We're going to take the wages of computer programmers, and then we're going to multiply that by a factor that adjusts for external costs. We've done this in a couple of different ways. The way we do it now is we use the same factor that we think the BEA is using, basically a multiplier of 2.02. And what you can see, if you look at that green line on the bottom, well, that's our own account software. It's $37 billion. It's not as high as what you would see in prepackaged custom and own account. But what I want to show you is how rapidly it is rising. And that, I think, is one of the most exciting things. Next slide, please. Okay, this is what we get, right? So this is actually pretty interesting. we're seeing a really rapid increase. And so here is, I think, the thing that's so exciting to us is that here's something we need to be measuring and accounting for. Now, an unavoidable challenge in estimating this open source software is that there's going to be an overlap, right, between what is currently accounted for and that which is also research and development. But what I want to say that's really important is that we need to account for things that are freely available. This stock is available at no cost, and that I think makes it particularly useful. Okay, so next slide, please. So one of the things that is useful to think about when we're looking at where the contributions are coming from is that academic contributors to open source software are very significant, and they are very significant in other countries as well. So while in the United States, we can measure over 40,000 academic contributors, they are also very, you see a lot of academic contributors from China, the United Kingdom, and Canada. Okay, next one, please. Another area where we see a lot of contribution is from US federal agencies. Now, these are open source software that's on GitHub with federal affiliations for the contributors. And the Department of Energy has, now in this case, we're looking at repositories, and over 12, almost 11, we have 11,000 from the Department of Energy. And what I want you to take a look at is look on the bottom, Microsoft, Red Hat, and Berkeley. So the contributions from the Department of Energy alone is about half what you see from Microsoft or Red Hat, and more than what you see from University of California, Berkeley, which is the highest contributor. Okay, next slide, please. In terms of where we are with this analysis, when we measure and we show you the dollar values, these are the ones that we can actually assign. And so here is our 3.2 million contributors. And what you can see is that just about half of them, 44%, have some geographic data that we can use. 38% have valid country data. And when we put the numbers out, these are the ones that are already assigned. Okay, so this is the extent of how much we've been able to measure. Next slide, please. And so what I want to tell you here in terms of the what we've done so far, this open source software is an important source of non-market capital. It's growing rapidly. Data on contributors and their contributions allow us to do comparisons in person months. We believe this is within the framework of the S&A. Contributors from universities and governments are substantial, and the applications that we've made and shared with our users are, I think, an example of why these tools are useful. We are creating tools that can be used to extend these estimates in other countries. And so next slide, please. And so where are we going with this? I told you we have about 38% match. We're going to keep going with that. And we also know that there are repositories outside of GitHub. We will include those. One thing you're going to be really interested in is how broadly represented are our parameters. And we can adjust those for different types of software. And we have found ways to identify what is system software, what's a game, use different parameters. And then next slide. Finally, I want to show you these. This is where you can go get the packages that my colleagues have created, and you can share them. And with that, I'm ready to take your questions.
Carol, thank you so much for that fantastically interesting talk. And speaking personally, the data science campus at the ONS, our kind of workflow and productivity has really been changed by GitHub. So it's really interesting to see that rise in use reflected in your data too. We're going to pass over to Juan now, who's going to discuss this paper. And just to remind you, you've got 5 minutes. Juan.
Okay.
Okay, so I have a couple of slides to go through. Okay, so it's great to be here. It's a great honor to be here to talk about a paper measuring open source software. I think this is a really important area. We are not really measuring open source yet. It is in some ways somewhat like the dark matter of the digital economy. So much digital infrastructure, critical digital infrastructure, is based on the software contributed by volunteers, as this comic book sketch points out, sometimes not very well supported people. And we have very little evidence about how many people are doing this, what is the level of investment that this generates, what is the value that is created. And this makes it very difficult to put in place policies to support these efforts in a way that ensures the resilience of the digital economy. So efforts like the one that Carol presented are critical in terms of addressing this evidence gap and informing policy to strengthen our digital economy. So what the paper is doing is basically starting with users of GitHub, as we heard, a popular platform for collaborative coding, looking at the code that these users contribute to repos, which are projects, then estimating the amount of time that this takes using the COCOMO model, then taking developer salaries as a measure of the opportunity cost of this time that developers are spending contributing to open source software, and also taking metadata about these users in order to infer the countries where they are based. Put everything together, you get investment by country and sector. And the wonderful addition is that it's very consistent with the spirit of the phenomenon being studied. We're getting the open source software developed for the project so that we can use it ourselves, which is amazing. And really thank Carol and her team for doing that. And we really wish more people did that. So I have some points for clarification and areas for extension, and maybe some of these things are already maybe have already been taken care of. I just didn't see them mentioned in the paper, so I wanted to flag them up. So I guess the first one is thinking about the GitHub users. Many GitHub users are not professional developers. Many of them are students. Many of them are researchers. So how do we account for that? Then looking at the geolocation of the people in GitHub, we heard around 38% of the, only 38% of the users have been geolocated. Could this be creating some biases that we need to take into account, for example, when we do international comparisons? Looking at code commits, I guess one thing that we need to take into account is that over time, it might take less lines of code to deliver on a given function. In other words, the code might be becoming higher quality, developers might be getting more productive. How do we take that into account as we analyze the evolution of activity over time? GitHub repos are not always software. Very often people will upload their papers and LaTeX. They will update Jupyter notebooks for reproducibility, but this is not really code that anyone would take and build on or use. So there's a question about how do we take into account all of the repos in GitHub, which are not really software. As pointed out before, the COCOMO model makes certain assumptions about the complexity of the application being developed and the size of the team. There's a lot of variation in that in GitHub, so that how do we take that into account in order to estimate the effort required to develop different types of software. And finally, I think it's a very important point, is that we are kind of assuming that all contributors to GitHub are professional software developers. And actually, and we are taking the salaries for that occupation in order to estimate the level of investment. Yet, as I pointed out before, many of the people in GitHub are students, they are researchers, they work with different programming languages. There's massive variation in the salaries for developers that use different programming languages. So there's a question about how do we account for that heterogeneity when we generate our estimates. So I conclude with some suggestions. Could we assess the coverage issues that I mentioned? Are non-geotagged users different from geotagged ones? Can we filter users by level of activity to exclude students and hobbyists? Can we filter repos by programming language so that we're able to focus on software that's actually going to be reused by other people? Can we filter repos by proxies for usage? Can we tune, as Carol mentioned, the COCOMO model parameters to account for project size and application type? And can we maybe find a way to consider bring variation in developer salaries or even salaries for coders who are not working in industry into the analysis? And finally, because there's so many parameters being used in the analysis here, I think it would be very useful to present ranges or confidence intervals rather than point estimates of investment. And finally, very, very much connected with the point that Carol made, how do we start accounting for the value of openness and the fact that this software is available for everybody to use once it's uploaded into GitHub? And that's it from me. Thank you very much.
Fantastic. Thanks, Juan. So we've got some time for some questions now, and those are going to be hybrid, so both online and in person. So would anyone like to start us off in the hall here? And if you wouldn't mind just saying who you are as well. Yeah.
Google in 2015, Microsoft in 2016, Amazon in 2017, and Facebook also have open source artificial intelligence software. One imagines the combined value of them having everybody use or many users of their software and accumulating the knowledge and the know-how and the different things that are there will have considerable benefit. Obviously, it's not a cost, but it's possibly a benefit that isn't appreciated.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Carol, Juan, do either of you want to comment on that?
So, I'm not sure I heard all of it, but I think that the question was about the open source software which is being shared by businesses such as Microsoft and Facebook. Is that the question?
Yes, so it's a comment on the fact that this is quite a skewed distribution. Those big tech firms are producing quite a lot of the output. I suppose it'd be useful if you could comment on whether that's the right take on what's happening.
Oh, okay, now I'm with you. Actually, most of the contributors to open source software that we have found are actually individual contributors. So while it is true that there is a lot of contribution by businesses, there's actually a lot that are coming from individuals and from university teams. And so I'm not sure why it would bias the estimates that a lot of it is from business. I would think we would actually wish to account for that. And in this particular case, what we've got is a business creating something for their own use, which is then shared for other people to use as well. And we would very much want to have that as part of our open source capital stock estimate, because that's the amount of software which is being shared.
Okay, fantastic. Let's go to our next question.
Jonathan Haskell, Imperial College. Carol, that's absolutely fantastic and really, really interesting. I'm always struck, especially talking to banks, as I have to do, when you talk to them about open source software, they just use this all the time, and not least because one of the difficulties that many banks or many organizations have is different vintages of software which they develop over periods of time. It's so difficult to coordinate all of that stuff. So that strongly suggests, and Juan touched on this, that there are just ginormous spillovers from the open source community, obviously, to the private community, but it also suggests there are kind of intertemporal spillovers, so that generation 1 of programmers who uses open source inform generation 2 of programmers. And then that takes one to the question about within the GitHub community itself, Are there those kind of spillovers going on as well, that everybody's kind of learning from each other as well? So there's sort of enormous TFP going on within that community, and how does one figure that into the calculations? But enjoyed the paper very much. Thank you.
So I really love that question. We have one of my colleagues on the team has a sense that the depreciation of open source software may well be much less than the depreciation of business software, which sort of has this built-in obsolescence. And what we have done in these estimates is we've really just taken a 30% depreciation rate, which would come from private market software, and applied that. And so I think that the issue of depreciation and price index, these two things are very complicated, and I would not say that we've got that nailed. I think we're really just in on the beginning of it. With respect to different types of software, what we will be able to do is identify, is this system software? Is this financial software? Is this gaming software? Is this an application? And apply different parameters. And indeed, some of the users or contributors are less skilled. And if we had that information, then we could make an adjustment to the person month calculation to show that it takes more time to do. But the other thing I did want to say is that I actually think it's important to include the individuals and the hobbyists, because there's a lot that's being done. Eric von Hippel's work and Dan Sickles' work has told us that householders, or people that are entrepreneurs before they've started their business, are really contributing a lot in this space. The trick it's not a trick. We are only using open source licensed software. So if you put a paper on GitHub, a Jupyter notebook, we're not counting that. It has to be production ready, and it has to be produced with a license. And so that really does limit what we're choosing.
Fantastic, thank you. We've probably got time to squeeze in just one more answer. So I'm just going to pick up a few ones so that you can respond to a few at once. So we had a question from Sanjeev Mahajan online, just asking how will you address the double counting element of free and or paid labor, materials, etc., with other software development intangibles? There's a question from also about versioning and how you're accounting for that. And there's a gentleman at the back there who wanted to say something as well.
Thanks. Dan Sickle, Wellesley College. Hey, Carol. Wonderful presentation, wonderful paper. I was just hoping you could say just a little bit more about price deflators. And in particular, what perhaps you've learned from this entire enterprise that might give you some thoughts on new directions to go for getting measures of prices that might be more appropriate than, you know, sort of taking the standard off the shelf sorts of things.
Great.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. And I'm just going to add one more to that, which is, have you looked at quality measures like code coverage, tests, continuous integration, pre-commit hooks, and accounting for quality that way?
Okay, so with regard to the last question, the answer to that is no. And I made a note of that for us to look at. Moving to Dan's question about the deflators, well, I think most people do realize that all the action is in the deflator. And one of my slides that I went by pretty quickly showed that if you were to use a different deflator, so let's say you use the prepackaged software deflator instead of the own accounting custom deflator, you would get $10 billion more of investment in 2019 than we measured. And that comes back to Juan Mateo's questions about ranges. Yes, I think that it is appropriate, because if we were to use different deflators or different depreciation measures, you could move that value up or down quite a bit. But I think it also points out, and I think this is to Dan's question, we might want to take another look at the deflators that are currently being used for own account and custom software, because they really do not show quality improvement over time, right? It's a cost deflator. So I think that that's really critical. How do we do that? Okay, now I'll call out Shane Greenstein and Frank Nagel and the work that they've done, where you are able to actually count the queues, right? This is how many servers are out there. And you believe you've got a good comparative price, like a Microsoft server for an Apache server. There is a place where I think you can get a good price times quantity and begin to say, for that tool, we can actually nail the deflator. The challenge, and what frightens me, I guess, dudes, is that a lot of times we figure out a deflator for one thing, and then we apply it to everything else that's similar. So I think a little bit of care there is going to be important, and that's why we really started just with a fixed parameter. The double counting is really critical, and we haven't nailed that, okay? So it's not only an overlap between existing software, it's also an overlap with R&D expenditures, right? So if we're interested in public funds, then we want to be able to take that into account. Now, how are we going to do that? We tried to do as much as we could without survey data, and that was actually kind of fun, but there are survey data that we could bring to bear on this. For example, the business R&D survey from the United States gives an estimate of software which is created as a portion of R&D. We can use that. The BEA has an overlap between R&D and software. But I think it's really important to think about this capital stock as a different animal, right? Even if you know how much is business investment, I think it's useful to have a separate count of that which is freely available because it has a different role in the economy.
Carol, that's absolutely fascinating. We could talk about this all day. And there's some lessons for me and my ONS colleagues there about what we should ask on surveys, I think, about open source. But we must move on because we've got many more exciting talks to go. Next, we're going to hear from Diane Coyle on creating and governing the social value of data.
Morning, morning, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. It's going to be a fascinating day. I want to talk about the value that is generated from data that isn't commercially realizable. And so the first slide is about the motivation for this work. There is a growing literature on understanding the value of data. Some of it's theoretical. And in my reading, a lot of those papers draw the conclusions that come from their assumptions. So if they highlight privacy as a negative externality, they get to the conclusion that there's too much data collection going on and so on. But there's also a small but growing empirical literature that we are aiming to contribute to, and a range of methods for thinking about how to value data. And one of the obvious places to start looking is in market prices, and this can be either market capitalization of different types of companies or parts of their expenditure capitalized, or the few data markets that exist, and there are not many of those, and in fact very few that have any posted prices. You can also look, and again this is a small but growing area, at the difference that the use of data sets or different techniques makes to organizational outcomes such as profits or productivity. But all of these ignore the gap between the private and the social value, which is what I'm focusing on. So just to organize thoughts, we try to bring two lenses to bear when thinking about this. And the left-hand column here won't need laboring in this audience, but is news to many non-economist audiences. And that's about, first of all, the fundamental non-rivalry of data, about the positive and negative externalities. The negative ones are about security and privacy loss. The positive ones are about the additional information, in fact, the growing information value you get from combining different kinds of data. And this could be within organizations like the big tech companies, pulling together everything they possibly can about each of us as individuals, but it could be among organizations or among data sets. And I think the experience of creating large data sets that combine biomedical and social data and economic data during the pandemic is a great demonstration of the potential value there. There are highly variable kinds of returns and depreciation rates. Some types of databases have rapidly diminishing returns. For example, if you're using data for marketing purposes, once you have a certain number of individuals, adding more and more individuals has rapidly diminishing returns. But then there are other types of data where exactly the opposite is true, or indeed the same for depreciation rates. And we touched on this a little bit in the last discussion. If it's marketing data, the depreciation may not be all that rapid. A certain kind of people will buy a certain kind of product. But if it's the kind of data from sensors for autonomous vehicles, then that's going to depreciate very rapidly indeed. And then the other 2 points about the economics are the importance of complementary investments to get value from your data, and also the balance between the fixed and the marginal costs being obviously very, very low. But the other lens is all really about what you might summarize as quality of the data, the provenance, the sensitivity of the subject, the extent to which it's reference data, its accuracy, and also can people use it? Can they access it? And so the value to Amazon of its data is very large indeed, but nobody else can access that data. So that limits its value to society. The basic economics of this are such that there's some very obvious conclusions that the market values are not going to give you an estimate of economic welfare, societal welfare, and there's a divergence between the social and the private value. The use values are going to be highly heterogeneous, and this is true obviously whenever you're trying to aggregate economic goods, but I think particularly true with data. And exactly the same database could be used for very different purposes and therefore create very different use values. And it has a fundamentally relational value. The policy debate has been shaped by the fact that the legal presumption is that once people start to create a database, they own it, they own that data, and we talk about it as if it were a standard good that you can transact. But the valuable information that you get from data is almost always involves some kind of relational aspect. So even something that seems extremely personal, such as my temperature, only has information value for me if I know what the population average is, and in today's circumstances clearly has information value for anybody else I'm standing in the same room as. And so this relational character is really important. And so we came at this trying to think about what are the policy choices involved. There's a very live debate about data policy at the moment in all countries, and generally people are swimming around trying to understand how to think about the value. And I'm particularly interested in questions such as how much should the government or the public sector be investing in creating data? It's part of the national economic infrastructure. The cliche is data is the new oil. That's just as true for all uses, not just business uses. But also questions about data access and how that relates to market power, because there are competition questions about the hordes of data that the big tech companies have accumulated. So just to dig into a couple of those points, I don't know if you know the story about the ape that took the selfie picture, and the photographer set up a trip wire so that he could photograph the apes in this particular forest, and this charming creature took its own photograph, smiling nicely for the camera. And there were several court cases about this. The photographer brought a case to claim intellectual property ownership and said that because people were using this photograph, he was being deprived of massive earnings. And PETA, the animal charity, brought a court case to say the ape owned the intellectual property and the copyright fees should be paid to animal charities such as PETA to look after the apes. So both of those cases were lost. And the point of the anecdote is that if I post a photograph, is it mine because I took the picture, or is it the person whose photograph I took? And it's just really hard to map the value, the use value that you can get from data onto this sole ownership concept. Some of the policy propositions, such as paying people for their individual data, I think just miss this point. They take the property concept as the right one. The other illustration is the positive externalities, which I mentioned. And this is a heat map from Strava. It's a fitness app. And when you sign, you tick the terms and conditions, you upload your data to the app. They combine the routes that people run and they put them on their website as heat maps. Now, the trouble is that a lot of American soldiers have the Strava fitness app on their watches and they run around top secret bases. And so this is an image of one of the top secret bases whose perimeter was illustrated by combining all the individual data. So it's just one small example of the importance of these, or the potential scope of these positive externalities. In the paper, we talk about the concepts, but also look at a case study in UK transport to illustrate some of the policy dilemmas. And there have been several shifts in transport policy over time. And the first stage was thinking about the trade-off between opening up data for public good. And there was a big fight, and my colleague Frank Kelly, who was the scientific advisor at the Home Office, the Department of Transport at the time, was involved in this debate with private bus companies about whether they should release their timetable data. They argued that it was commercially important and that if they released the data, their competing bus companies would be able to undercut them by timetabling 2 minutes earlier to pick up all the passengers. But the bus timetable data was made freely available at that stage. And on this website, Transport Direct Info, that enabled the creation of really useful apps such as City Mapper, which mean that we don't get stuck waiting for buses that are never going to come, or we can route around congestion easily and so on. So tremendous time savings in a free app. Another trade-off in the policy debate is about the collection of public data by public bodies themselves and the extent to which they should just fund that from tax revenues, from the money the government allocates to their budgets, and not worry about recovering any of that, or the extent to which they should start to charge commercial prices for it. And it's a particularly active debate in geospatial data because mapping apps and autonomous vehicles are going to be commercially very valuable. There's also been the entry of firms like Uber and deals being done, for example, between Heathrow Airport and Uber, which don't involve the provision of data to the public sector. So Uber collects a lot of valuable data about demand around the airport and how busy it is, but they're not required to hand that over to the public authorities. And so we're still debating these kinds of policy trade-offs. So the paper that we posted explores these trade-offs and the policy dilemmas and how to possibly think about these, and suggests some possible empirical approaches. And I do think, oh, sorry, I'm behind my slides. I do think the empirics are going to be important to start to answer these questions. They don't need to be very exact, but we need to have some ballpark figures to understand what the trade-offs are, including what is the worthwhile public investment in public open data, including national statistics? What's the benefit cost case that you can make for allocating more money to that? And thinking about these trade-offs, how much should public bodies think about charging commercial providers as opposed to individuals using reference data sets? So in this paper, we suggested some possible methods, and my team has started to try to apply some of these. The next slide, so I should say, yes, stated preference and discrete choice methods and real options are the ones that we're piloting. This is a slide from a paper, an ESCoE working paper that I co-authored with Wendy Lee, where we use the market capitalization approach. So this is just an illustration of how you might think about that. And the left-hand panel shows what happened to Marriott's share price when Airbnb entered the market, and how that compares to the previous trend. So we can take that wedge and aggregate that up. And that's just one illustration of the increasing number that are using share prices as a market approach to this. But that doesn't help me with my policy questions. So we have a working paper that I think is about to come out as an ESCoE paper and is on the Bennett website also, using discrete choice experiments. These are widely used in the commercial sector to help companies understand how to price their products and what attributes people value. And you bundle together different attributes and present people with a choice experiment. So you can pick your attributes. We thought about granularity, frequency of the data, timeliness of the data, and price. Potential price is one of the attributes. And so this chart shows how people value different attributes relative to the benchmark that you pick in these discrete choice experiments. And so in this case, I'll have to stand back to look at it because it's a bit pale. So there's a value, for example, put on, this is an experiment using a survey of economists, and it's the World Bank database to see what they thought about that. So for example, the different kinds of country grouping stands out as something that's very positively valued, and using non-standard software is something that stands out as being very negatively valued. And you can run these experiments several times to, multiple times to test this. So we had a sample of about 400 respondents who are members of the American Economic Association in this pilot. And this might be something that would be useful both to understand which attributes of data sets users most value, but also if you're thinking about charging commercial users as opposed to individual or academic users, how to think about pricing that. We're just about starting to think about real options methods and whether you can use that approach to capture some of the very distinct use values that different users will get from the same data sets. So to sum up, there are many possible ways of thinking about this, and we've just tried two of them. So sum of costs, setting up data markets, and that's a market design challenge, but then that would give you prices for certain kinds of standardized data sets, share prices, machine learning methods that use Shapley values to allocate parts of profits to the use of data as opposed to other inputs. And then these discrete choice experiments, other stated preference methods, and real options. So I don't think there's a right answer, and I don't think we're ever going to get any exact number. But the policy dilemmas that are being faced at the moment, and the fundamental question about how much is open data and public data worth, and how much should the government be investing in it at a time when the private sector is investing hugely in data, I think do require some kind of empirical approach. So as you can tell, this is very much work in progress, and I don't think I've got all the answers. So I'm really looking forward to hearing any comments, including from Martin.
Thank you, Diane. That's a fantastically interesting talk, which goes to some of those questions I mentioned at the start about timeliness and granularity. And I'm glad to see other people have a high negative value on proprietary data as well. We're now going to hear from Martin Wheel to discuss this paper.
Well, thank you very much, Diane, for raising some absolutely fascinating questions. No, as I suppose an economic statistician, I think my interest was perhaps mainly in the question of how you should value the data. I appreciate that's not quite the same thing as governing the social value of data, but your paper contained a number of suggestions on how one might do that. So how do data add value? Well, they may add value in the production process. Of course, they typically aren't used up, but they do become obsolete, often fairly rapidly. The marginal return to data analysis may be quite high. And over the last 40 years, there has been quite a big change in the government's attitude to the provision of data. in the 1980s, the Rayner report on the ONS, or CSO as it was then, notoriously said that the government should provide only the data that were needed for the purposes of governing. It paid no attention to the fact that the opposition may need data for the purposes of opposing the government, or to the many other public uses that might be made. So how might we value the framework? Well, how might we value the data? We can think of data as capital, the idea that data generate extra income through their exploitation. Now that, of course, assumes that there's no consumption value in data. Maybe you have to be a bit of a nerd to believe that there is consumption value in data, but Florence Nightingale famously said she derived as much pleasure from looking at tables as data, tables of data as she did from reading novels. Some of the value of data may be a consolidation of monopoly power, and that may, its value may overstate the benefit. Of course, the data may result in savings of time rather than savings of money by enhancing understanding of the environment. The paper looks at a contingent valuation and willingness to pay based on Facebook. I suppose, since I don't use Facebook, I don't know quite what I'm missing, but I haven't felt it would fill a large gap in my life. How far Facebook is a source of information rather than a source of data, I'm not sure. I don't think they're quite the same thing. And I must say, the example you provided about transport, I really didn't understand how bus companies expect people to use buses if they keep their timetables secret. I was a bit beyond me. I had always thought that the whole point of providing transport services was that you communicated with the people you wanted to use them by telling them when they could use them. So a bit of clarity on that, please. But I did feel there are quite large areas of data to which this framework perhaps is a bit more difficult to apply. So here I've got a slide about the UK Biobank, 500,000 old and older people recruited in about 2006. I was one of them, a medical examination, and the idea is that then this tracks these people to the grave, and because it's a large sample, you can build understanding of rare diseases. Of course, the benefits from that may be quite substantial, they may not. We simply don't know. I'm not sure that we have enough information to be able to think of valuing this in terms of options, because we simply have a veil of ignorance. Perhaps an example of data collection which did turn out to be very valuable ex post was provided by John Snow. In 1854, the Broad Street cholera outbreak killed about 600 people. He famously showed that the people who were suffering from cholera were all collecting their water from the same pump. Closing the pump locally stopped the cholera outbreak, and that was the beginning of the understanding that cholera was a waterborne disease rather than a disease spread atmospherically. And how many lives that has saved, I don't know. But should we put a high value on John Snow's data set, or should we put the high value on the analysis that it allowed? Plainly, a high value goes somewhere, and that doesn't show in the in any of the statistics that we typically use or create. So, as I say, applying valuation methods, the valuation methods discussed in the paper to medical data, I'm not too sure they would work, because I think we probably don't know enough about them. You can't look at the cost of collecting the data because, or you see only some of the costs of collecting the data, because of course the people who provided the samples and underwent the initial medicals were expected to do it for nothing, and 500,000 people did do it for nothing. Anyway, what conclusions do we come to? Well, data have characteristics of non-rival capital. There are certainly, as the paper mentions, economies of scope from combining data. my sense was that the paper was perhaps focused on specific types of quasi-commercial data, and that's perhaps where we're most likely to find valuation methods working, those that are fairly close to the market, even if not in the market. But Diane, thank you very much for raising some absolutely fascinating issues that I certainly had not thought about until I had the pleasure of reading your paper.
Fantastic, thank you, Martin. We can go to questions now, but Diane, do you want to come back on anything that Martin said first?
No, I just stood up for questions.
Okay, fantastic. I saw you leaping up, ready to defend. So questions, we haven't got any online, so it's over to the floor. Yes, you had your hand up first, and there's a mic on the way, if you wouldn't mind speaking into that so that people watching at home can hear too.
Well, very interesting paper. It occurred to me data is used in so many different contexts and has so many different applications. It seems like we're never going to have one method that works everywhere. We're going to have to decide under which cases we use which method. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Not in a very systematic way. But as I said right at the start, I don't think we're going to get exact answers, and I'm not sure exact answers matter. But to take Martin's fantastic biobank example, that's a really costly asset to maintain. And so there's clearly a sense that some of these option values would be high. And surely we would increase the option value to any biomedical data after the experience of the past 2 years. And I don't think that we're going to get beyond the veil of ignorance about potential future uses, but we need to enable decision-making about those kinds of investments by putting some number on it. So that's what this is all about. The next stage in thinking about this is, as you suggest, and Martin alluded to think about which types of approach in which types of context and which types of data.
Okay, we've got time for another couple of questions, yeah?
Joe Grice, ONS. Thanks very much, Diane, and thanks, Martin, as well, for a very, very informative paper and comments. I'm very taken, Diane, by the point that there are clearly going to be market failures if we simply, with data, given the circumstances. I think most people would be receptive to that. Also, I'm very receptive to the idea that actually empirical analysis is going to be important in motivating and sometimes the trade-offs that are necessary. What I'm a bit more concerned about is what I think in the trade is known as the Bob the Builder syndrome. Is there a problem? Yes, there is. Can we fix it? Yes, we can. And there are really questions about whether we can fix it. 3 issues occur to me. Is first of all, that if you have a public intervention, government intervention, in some cases, Martin gave a very good illustration, that may be quite a difficult analysis to carry out, at least with any degree of certainty. Secondly, what I suppose cynically one might call government incompetence, would they be able to implement the solution in a sensible way? And thirdly, perhaps more important in this context, optimism bias, whether actually the analysis gets skewed by what turn out to be optimistic assumptions of various parts of the calculus. Thank you.
They're great cautions, Joe. I suppose the way I'm thinking about it is at a time when decisions are being made about who should get access on what terms to some potentially very valuable sources of data. So take the GP data about which there's been discussion recently. I suppose I'm concerned that we don't foreclose potential valuable uses, whether that's new entrants into markets that are quite monopolistic or potential public benefit uses, or even thinking about the allocation of total welfare to consumers versus the corporations that might get access to that data. So to repeat myself, I'm not trying to come up with the right answer to this. I'm trying to make a contribution to policy decisions that are at this moment occurring in every country in the world, where the kind of interlocutor to the policy decisions of very large tech companies that have got very large data holdings.
Fantastic. We've just got time to squeeze in one more question. And Jonathan, I think you had your hand up first.
Thank you very much. Jonathan Haskell. Fascinated, Diane, by the conversation about property rights. And I just don't know, how do we think about the optimal allocation of property rights on the data? So to take Martin's excellent example, does the data that, Martin, you've provided to the NHS, if you just assume that it resides with Martin, then of course he should be selling it to people. So how do we think about whether it optimally, should be allocated to him, to the NHS, to Google, who then do something with it, or whatever? Really interesting question.
I think property rights are the wrong way to think about it, and it isn't a standard economic good. I would think about it in terms of societal relations and rights of access. In sociology, there's a concept of privacy in public. And in the offline world, people need to know certain things about us in certain contexts, but they don't get permission to join up everything about us. And that's not carried over into the online world. So a lot of the concern about privacy isn't that the pub needs to know that you're over 18, or the bank needs to know that you are who you say you are and your money's come from where you say it has. It's that the government or Amazon or Apple can combine a lot of data about you and therefore gain intrusive power over your life and your privacy. And there are technical solutions emerging to create differential privacy and rules of access. And I think, given that we live in a society and any data that we create involves relations with other people, that's a much better way to think about these data transactions than it's a piece of property, who owns it and how can we transact it.
Well, thank you for a fantastically interesting talk, Diane, and a really engaging discussion, Martin. We are going to have to move on now, although I'm sure we can talk about this a lot more. And we're going to hear from Hugo de Bondt now, who's going to tell us about estimating the value of data in the Netherlands. And I'll be definitely taking notes for this one, for the UK situation. Over to you, Hugo.
First of all, thanks a lot to the organizers for having the opportunity to present this work on estimating the value of data in the Netherlands. This work was part of a broader research program and is still part of a broader research program conducted at Statistics Netherlands and is geared towards or aimed at providing measures for all kinds of new phenomena that are happening within the economy. It was also kindly financed by our Ministry of Economic Affairs over the periods of 2019-2020. So it's we finished the program in December last year, but we're still thinking about extensions. The outline, some basic concepts and considerations and also limitations have to be put in place before the framework we used can actually be applied. I will tell you something about the application of the framework we eventually used, some results and some concluding remarks. So we started out this research thinking about data quite broadly. So the literature shows that you have three ways of putting a number on the value of data. The first is all using a supply and use framework, which was used by the OECD, just counting the supply or use of data carriers and data related services. Another strand of is more or less a case study research, putting a value of data per business. So that most of you probably know that company accounts or company balance sheets do not put the value of data on their balance sheet, but the research by Wendy Lee shows that you can actually make a case study research and calculate a value. And the second option, and is also the option or the research that we use, is using the framework designed by Statistics Canada, and that is regarding data as as a national accounts asset. So the reason we did that is because it's given data availability. It's the more easier way of calculating the value of data. And for instance, supply and use have a much more need for granular data. And also, if you look at business values, that is not an exhaustive concept. And it has an advantage that you can actually link the results to other concepts and variables in national accounts such as GDP and total investment. So what they did at Statistics Canada, they regarded data as part of a larger value chain. So you start off with observations those are things that are naturally occurring, such as the outside temperature or human behavior, that is then transformed into a digitized format, which we call data. That can be done by human effort, and it can also be done automatically, but still it's then considered a produced assets. Of course, you need to organize the data into a database, and then eventually you can learn all kinds of useful stuff from that data by using data science or data analytics, just whatever you would like to call it. So before you can start off and use this kind of framework, you need to put some constraints or some limitations in place for actually to be able to come up with a value. So first of all, you have to say that digital data are digital, so that you exclude all kinds of data that are put on paper. You have to think about the ownership of assets. Since we first start looking at the producer of an asset. You also have to think that if you produce it, then you also own it, and that could be in contradictions to privacy laws, to for instance the GDPR, which is put in place in the European Union. That is a bit, but still we use it to make the whole framework actually function. So yeah, I have to think about freely available data. In our case, we excluded it because for a more narrow concept of national accounts asset, there has to be an owner who can reap the economic benefits from the asset. So if for instance, if my office just puts all of their data, all of the results on their website, that you can't really think of it as in terms of ownership. So we excluded government. So, and also a different issue with government is because we, in a later slide, I will show you that we're using sum of cost. But if you're using sum of cost, that does not sit well with the government, because that is a valuation. So for instance, if you think about businesses are able to make a profit on their investment. So sum of cost is then a much more reasonable approach. A government does not have an incentive to make a profit out of the data they produce. So that raises questions on the valuation. So and the last point, which is more general, is that if you think about sum of cost, then it might be a bit technical, but if the consumption of fixed capital of past data investments also feed into the investment of newer assets, you will get an endlessly virtuous cycle, which is also more striking with government. So almost the final point is we excluded outright sale of data assets. So it might be the case that there are businesses producing data sets for third parties. It does not occur too often. What does occur is that there is an acquisition of data through mergers and acquisitions, so purchasing other businesses because they own sets of valuable data. And also we exclude the cross-border transaction. That is something we have to put in place, because data on those transactions where data assets actually cross a border are quite difficult. So like I said, it deals with own account investment, as is often used in national accounts in the context of R&D and software, and also using a cost-based approach. So like I said, the entire framework was developed by Statistics Canada back in 2019, and it gives you an estimate for produced capital own account investment. So it relates to the own account part, so it relates to databases and data science. The observations are considered non-produced, which I totally agree with. So what makes it possible to come up with an estimate is that you use the cost, so compensation of employees, you add a bit of other costs, and finally you add a return to capital. And what you need are specific occupations that you think are engaged in the production of data assets, so that those people can be sales and marketing, data entry clerks, statistical, finance staff, mathematicians, economists, financial advisors, database and network specialists, etc. So we took the framework from Statistics Canada, and there is a certain percentage of the effort of the people that you assign to the production of data. It is, to my knowledge, a best guess of their effort. So there is a difference. There's a difference. So there are high range values and more low range values, just to indicate that it's not completely certain. We added other costs, which are 60%, which I took from the R&D survey, which also has these items, so that I was able to calculate that 60%. We added the markup for capital. Now, finally, because national accounts is interested in not only in value changes or nominal values, but also the volume changes, we also compiled a deflator. I must say this deflator is based on inputs, as is also quite usual in own account deflator. So it consists of compensation of employees of NACE 62, which is the web, the internet, what's it called, information services, and also NACE 72, which is the R&D industry. We add also the deflator for other costs of intermediate consumption, and also the deflator for GFCF, which are all taken from the supply and use tables. Now, finally, we also add an assumed productivity increase. That increase is not based on any kind of research, but given the fact that you're using an input-based deflator, it seems reasonable to add a productivity increase. Now, what we did to actually calculate these compensation costs, we combined the labor force survey, which is based on a sample survey design, and also we added the administrative data. We pooled the years, so we pooled 3 years, so we used T-1, T, and T+1 together, and then we linked that to the administrative data of year T, and it gives you a greater number of observations. So what then happens is that your original weights that you take from the LFS are no longer valid, so you have to recalculate the weight. So on average, they are 3 times too high, so you have to, but you know all of the information of the entire population, also the sample weight, so you can recalculate the exact weight for that year that you actually need. So I'm already at the results. So like I said, the results are based on low range values and high range values. I must say that we studied the period from 2001 up until 2017. The first 5 years are based on a slightly different data set, but the general direction is clear, and so we start off for the high range values at about 10 billion euros in current prices in the first year, and we end with approximately 20 billion for the high range values in 2017. So if you then disaggregate into the subtype, you see that there are quite some differences between the three subtypes that we distinguish. So first of all, you see the value of data growing quite gradually over time and not that fast. You see data science actually growing really fast in the final years. That is also supported by the literature, which says that the data science or data analytics are probably the most profitable type of activity. So that sits well with the data we found. What struck us is that we saw some declines in nominal terms of database investments. That might seem a bit strange at first, but what we dug into it a bit deeper, and from an international sourcing survey, we found that Dutch businesses over time actually outsourced business support activities to countries like India and other European countries. So that then is quite a good explanation for the declines in investment values we found. Could also be that the data are actually quite good, and that the productivity of database investment has gone up considerably, but that is less likely because the Canadian paper did not find any decreases in database investment. So I'm putting my money on the outsourcing story. Almost at the end here we see again in this table the strong growth of data science activities. Now it is as a share, it's not that large still. So you see that the total growth is a bit lower. You also see the declines also in volume terms of the databases. It might also, like I said, also be related to the deflator, but still it's quite striking. And then I would like to conclude. We noted not only here that there is a large amount of interest in this topic during the research, but like in any research, some improvements can be made. So the share of production activities is most preferably based on actually observed production activity. We can think about the occupation. Did we select the right occupations? We can think about, is the percentage of costs okay, and return to capital, and maybe there is an argument to be made for government ownership. And then there's a whole line of future research we can do, net stocks, think about a bit harder and longer about deflators, and also think about sales and purchases of data, especially for a smaller economy that is relatively open.
Hugo, thank you. That's absolutely fascinating. We better move on to hearing the discussion. Now, I, for one, am selfishly very pleased to hear about the big investment in data science. That's great news. And we're now going to hear from Eurydice Fotopoulou from ONS, who's going to discuss this paper.
Hello, and thank you for giving me the opportunity to read this paper. It was very interesting, and it was a joy to hear your experience in replicating what Stats Canada did. For this reason, I believe that it has significant contributions. The first one is giving us the opportunity to replicate and learn from the experience of one another when we try to take frameworks, apply in one context of a specific country to another. And the second one, which I found quite interesting, was the way that you managed to balance aspirations and ambitions with the SNA framework, which can be sometimes quite limiting. I also like the fact that the paper has very clear methodology, and you show awareness of the limitations of the technique. You alluded to some of them, such as untangling data ownership, which was mentioned earlier, the issue with cross-border transactions and how these may affect estimates. You also address in the paper something that Juan mentioned earlier in his discussion of the first paper, giving values using a range as opposed to show a lot of certainty, which sometimes cannot be founded. For these reasons, I think that it's a commendable effort because it increases the case, it strengthens the case for comparability to understand better cross-border transactions and data investment and learning. And I would be very curious to hear what are the implications of these findings for the Netherlands. Some thoughts after reading this paper and other contributions to the conference are considering second-hand data use. You mentioned that the low growth of data value in databases may point out to outsourcing or to a lesser extent quality improvement of data, but we could also have significant second-hand data use from one source to another. Then understanding how multinational firms use intangible assets. And recently, two contributions came out from the OECD and the Central Bank of France that address this issue, and it could be useful to understand the framework. Then something that you mentioned in the paper that you would like to do, but you didn't mention in the presentation, is including government data assets in estimates. And from what we have heard today and yesterday, this is something that is of a lot of interest, public data assets. Finally, you spoke about your ambition to produce stock estimates, but I think what is also quite important is to understand the limits between R&D, data science, and own production software when we are trying to produce these statistics to improve what we are trying to do. And with these thoughts, I conclude. Thank you very much. Very interesting paper.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Eurydice. We've got time for some questions before the break. I think this gentleman's hand went up first. And if you wouldn't mind saying who you are and also speaking into the microphone so people who are watching the live stream can hear you as well. Thanks.
Okay, Hannu Piekkola from University of Vaasa, Finland. So I would like to know the industry distribution of databases. It must be very concentrated to very few industries, even though the user of the database are distributed. So maybe you could use some input-output data or something to evaluate how it's distributed, this database across the industries. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. It wasn't an objective of this research, but from some of the data I looked at is that you notice that the industry J&K, so it's information communication, and also the banking sector really have employed over the years really a lot of these kinds of occupations. So you're entirely correct that there is a concentration, and it's in financial services. Yeah.
Okay, let's take another question. Yes, on the front row.
Marshall Reinsdorf, retired. I'm going to ask you a question. One of the issues that comes up with estimating the value of data this way is some of that investment might already be counted as investment in software, investment in R&D, or maybe it's some other kind of intangible. So I'm wondering how you grappled with the issue of overlaps, that something could be potentially double counted.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I agree. Here so conceptually the R&D is the same as the data analytics and data science. Before I started the research, I spoke to some businesses, and they did not really recognize their data analytics as a form of R&D. So from that practice, I would think that there is no overlap between R&D, that it just adds up. The issue of databases and software is a bit more difficult in a sense that the sources used to estimate software on own account is from a different survey than the one we used here. So the overlap is probably 100%, but we also may need to revise the original estimate of software on own account. Thanks.
Any other questions? Yes.
Leonard Nakamura, Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia. There are international organizations of chief data officers and people who are concerned with data management issues. And I wonder, have you talked with those associations? They might be a good way to better understand the relationship between your data and what's happening in the real world.
Thanks. Yeah, I did not speak to this international organization. I did speak to some businesses, the heads of unit of these data analytics units. They are somewhat removed from the concepts I am explaining here. So one of the interesting things they said is that data analytics is a constant learning process. They constantly provide all kinds of micro experiments from which they learn, and then they improve their product. So if you have a website that is selling all kinds of stuff, they replace the button, right, on all kinds of locations, and then test and check to see whether that improves sales. That is really fascinating, but that is really hard to capture in these kinds of aggregate national accounts statistics.
Well, I think that's probably all we have time for, because I think it's break time now. But I just want to say what a really interesting session that was, with such a wide range. These are questions that really go to the heart of what I care about, but it also, I think, of how the modern economy works today and how it will, it will move more towards these questions being really important tomorrow as well. So really important stuff. I just want to take a moment to thank all of our speakers and discussants for a fantastic session and a set of talk. Thank you.